questions.
Where would you like me to begin?
Any place you want.
Okay, well, I assume that all of you have studied and it's called, we'd like to use the word incarceration instead of internment. We're trying to emphasize the euphemisms. Does anybody know what euphemisms mean? Raise your hand. Okay, these are words that really mean something else. So, in other words, in 1942, the U.S. government was at the time after Pearl Harbor, and when President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942, the government was downplaying the inhumane and unconstitutional action of the government. So, with the Executive Order 9066 that President Roosevelt issued, and how many people know about executive orders? Good. Okay, so executive orders are issued by the President of the United States. In the Constitution doesn't specifically say that the President issues executive orders. What the Constitution does indicate is that the President has executive power. And executive orders go back to the time of actually our first president, George Washington, who actually issued executive orders as a means of directive to the military. And it wasn't really until President Roosevelt started using these executive orders in what I refer to as a negative procedure. That that's when the executive orders started to take a different turn. As you probably have learned, not know exactly what you know, but my father, Fred Kormatsu, was born in Oakland, California. That means he was an American citizen. And as an American citizen, he grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he thought he had rights as an American citizen because he learned about the Constitution in high school. And so when the executive order was issued, all due process of law was denied. Do you know what due process means?
Yes.
It means your rights. So your rights, excuse me, your rights. So no charge was no criminal charge was issued to the Japanese Americans. No one had access to an attorney. No one had access to a court hearing. And so that's how their rights as American citizens were denied. So, excuse me. So 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 were American citizens. So, how many of you were born in the United States? Okay, if you were born in the United States, and even if you were 1/16 of Japanese ancestry, so I'm half, you would have to report to a prison camp. And because even children, anyone under the age of 18, so 1/3 of the 120,000 people were under the age of 18, and people even of your age, down to babies, people that were in hospitals, people that were elderly, they all went into prison camps. So my father thought that was wrong, and when he had not obstructed the law, he had not done anything that would constitute a criminal act in that case before he would, so that he didn't report to this. First, they were detention, what they were called detention prison camps, which were temporary camps up and down the West Coast, half of Washington, Oregon, all of California, and half of Arizona. and they put people in. They try to find horse racetracks. So I don't know. Do you have a horse racetrack near you? No. If you go to a fairgrounds, they have horse tracks, or if you see the horse racing on television. So they put people in horse stalls. They whitewashed the walls, but they still smelled like manure. There was dirt on the floor and a light bulb over your head. You had a iron cot, and then they gave you like a flour sack, and you had to stuff it with straw, and then that was your bed. And that's how you had to live about 3 or 4 months until they sent you off to another permanent prison camp that was the 10 were across this country. So, but my father was arrested. So we don't know what happened or if he was spotted, but he was arrested in the San Francisco Bay Area about 30 days after everyone reported to these horse stalls, these prison camps. And then he finally ended up in a federal prison in San Francisco. And it was there that Mr. Bessick from the ACLU of Northern California visited him, which is the American Civil Liberties Union. And Mr. Bessick was looking for a test case because he thought it was unconstitutional to incarcerate one group of people because, quote, they look like the enemy, without any due process of law. He thought that was unconstitutional, which it is. And so he said to my dad, if need be, we'll take it all the way to the Supreme Court. So my father thought for sure by the time that his Supreme Court case was heard on the Supreme Court level that the Supreme Court justices would see this was an unconstitutional act. Because my father really believed in this country and believed in the government and believed in the rule of law. And he had decided to also to disobey the orders because he had a girlfriend at the time, not my mother, but an Italian girlfriend, which was also a conflict within the family. So the Italians were also they were put in prison camps, but they were also considered the enemy eventually, and the Germans, and they were not put in prison camps. So why were the Japanese Americans put in prison camps? And so his story is one of his love of
all students still participating in the Geography Bee competition proceed immediately to the cafetorium. Again, all students still participating in the Geography Bee competition and holding a yellow pass proceed directly to the cafetorium.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay. So it was like love of a girlfriend, love of family. There's love of it was love of country because he loved this country. He believed in this country. And in fact, before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, my father tried to enlist in the armed services. So before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, before World War II, there was talk of a military draft. And he and some friends tried to enlist in the Coast Guard and the National Guard. But my father was denied an application because he had a Japanese name. He was a Japanese person living, he has a Japanese name, even though he was an American citizen, because he said, well, I'm an American. I want to serve my country. So that happened before before the declaration of World War II and before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So, and then also when after the day after Pearl Harbor, my father worked at the shipyards because he still wanted to help with the war effort. And there was a note in the Time Saunter reporting to what was called the Boilermakers Union, and they fired him. They fired him because he was of Japanese ancestry, because he was working on ships that were going to go to the military. So you have to think, what makes someone make the decision to disobey the government, to disobey military orders, to disobey the President of the United States? Well, it's all those experiences that happen to you that you think, well, he tried to enlist in the service, he was trying to support the military effort and work in the shipyard. He was doing all these things to demonstrate what it is to be, a dedicated American citizen, and he was knocked down every single time. So you have to think, what would you do if you had all those experiences? When you were told, basically, by the government, that you don't belong in this country, even though you're born in this country, because you look like the enemy. Would that upset you? Yeah. And would you be able to talk about it to your friends? Probably not, because my father was really embarrassed that he was being treated by the military this way, when he had tried every single way to give back to this country. So when he was sent over after his bail hearing, he was sent over to the detention prison in the horse track called Tanforan, and because he had stood up against the government, everybody knew in this temporary prison camp that he had done that. So no one wanted anything to do with him. My father was vilified and ostracized from his own Japanese American community. No one wanted anything to do with him because they thought that if they associated with my father, some harm might come to them. So he went it alone. He had brought shame to the family. My grandmother was upset. My grandfather was disgusted. Not even his brothers supported him. And so he just lived, in this prison camp on his own, and eventually ended up in Detroit, Michigan after the war, towards the end of the war, and then married my mother, who was from South Carolina. And back in those days, because of the anti-racial marriage laws, they could not get married in California, and they could not get married in South Carolina. So they were married in Detroit, Michigan, and then came back to the Bay Area. But not until my father always had a criminal record. So for 40 years, he had a criminal record, a federal criminal record, meaning he wanted to become a real estate, a realtor, and have his real estate license so he could help other people he had been discriminated for housing. And he wanted to help other people. But because he had a federal prison record, he was denied his real estate license after he had been through a test and filled out an application. They said, no, you can't have a real estate license in California. So he also gave back to the community when my brother and I were growing up. He was part of the Boy Scouts. He helped with the Girl Scouts. He was in a service club called the International Lions Club. He helped with our church. So none of that ever stopped him. And he was not bitter or angry. But I didn't find out about my father's Supreme Court case until I was in high school. So when I was a junior studying U.S. government, my friend Maya got up in front of the class and gave a book report called Concentration Camps USA. So think about that. This book is called Concentration Camps USA. And then she talks about the Japanese American, what they called it back then, the internment. And she's describing this horrible period in time where people lost all their possessions. They had to live in prison camps. They didn't know when they were going to be getting out. They had lost their properties. They had lost their dignity. And that's the way that they had to live until the end of World War II. But then she went on to say, but there was this one man who resisted the military orders, and it ended up to be a landmark Supreme Court case called Kormatsu versus the United States. Oh, I said to myself, no, that's my name, because I went to a high school that was 2,500 students and only 6 Asian Americans, and the rest were all Caucasians. And all that I knew was Kormatsu was an unusual Japanese name. But she never said Fred. So afterwards I said to my friend Maya, what's this about? She said, well, this is about your dad. I said, no way. So I went home and asked my mother, and she said yes, and I got the standard answer, wait till your father gets home. And I asked him, and he simply said, it happened a long time ago, and what he did he thought was right, and the government was wrong. It wasn't complicated. And then we didn't talk about it again until the evidence was found in Washington, D.C. in 1982 by a professor that was writing a legal book that proved that there was no military necessity for the Japanese Americans to be forcibly removed from their homes. So at the time of my father's Supreme Court case, because in 1944 they still found him guilty. It was not a unanimous decision. It was a 6-3 decision, and the three dissenting opinions of Justice Jackson said, this lies around, referring to my father's case, like a loaded weapon, ready for anyone to pick up and use with a plausible cause. Justice Murphy called it the ugly abyss of racism, and Justice Owen Roberts said it was unconstitutional. So those are the opinions that said that this was wrong in 1944. But they found the evidence in Washington, D.C., that at the time of my father's Supreme Court hearing in 1944, so listen to this, the U.S. government, the Solicitor General's office, lied to the Supreme Court, they altered evidence, and they destroyed evidence. So if the Supreme Court had known all the facts, would the outcome have been the same? We don't know. But because of that evidence, they overturned my father's conviction, meaning he no longer had a prison record. And so, he was finally vindicated, and then the Japanese Americans were as well. And that set the precedent for the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that was signed by President Reagan, that was the official apology to anyone who was Japanese American and Japanese if they were still living. My grandparents had died, and they were given as a token $20,000 because people had lost their properties and lost their possessions and had to start over. But my father didn't stop there. He didn't want something like this to happen again. So he crisscrossed this country and spoke to students like you and other organizations. And on January 15, 1998, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, this country's highest honor. And now we also have days named after him. Florida has a day named after him, Fred Kormatsu, Fred Kormatsu Day of Civil Liberties and Constitution. That's what it's about, Civil Liberties Constitution. On January 30th, it's not a holiday yet, but actually with students at Clearwater Fundamental Middle School in Florida, outside of Tampa, that wrote letters to the Senator of Latvia, and they were responsible for establishing Fred Kormatsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution for the state of Florida.
Okay, that's wonderful. Are you ready for some questions? Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay, all right. Okay, so if she's already asked your question, don't ask it. See if we have another question to ask. Let's see. Deb. Okay, go ahead. Stand up and say your name.
Hi, my name is David.
Hi, Dave.
Were any of the same lawyers defending your father at the reopening trial?
No. Well, Mr. Bessick was no longer practicing. So you have to remember, it's 40 years later. So there was a new a legal team. These attorneys were, had certainly graduated from law school not too soon after, and many of them were Japanese American. Many weren't. Some were Chinese American. Some were Caucasian. They used when they found the evidence in Washington, D.C., they used a little-known legal procedure called petition of writ coram nobis. And coram nobis is a Latin term meaning an error has been made before us. An error has been made before the court. And you can use that when you've already served your sentence. So my father's sentence originally in 1942, when he first went to court, was probation for 7 years. And as long as you successfully fulfill that and you have done nothing else, and you've got it's not a criminal case, but a case that you can reopen, then you can do it at that. So all these young attorneys, new attorneys, and they worked pro bono. Pro bono means free of charge. So my father thought that attorneys were always expensive, and until his case was reopened, I didn't know that he always had not given up hope that someday he could reopen up his case. That's a long time to not give up hope for 40 years.
Okay, next. Go ahead, Louis, stand up.
My name is Luis, and how can the U.S. and other nations prevent similar events from occurring?
That's an excellent question. I think certainly education is the key. In 1942, you have to realize there were not other civil rights organizations that could stand up against the president and say, no, this is wrong. So now at least we have other civil rights and civil liberties organizations, and so it means to support each other, but also to educate other countries. I think the United Nations is an important organization where we try to do that, where we try to make other countries even accountable for their own actions. It's a long ways to go. But when people, when Americans see other issues of violations of human rights in other countries, it's up to us to stand up and say, no, that you cannot do that. So Mary, your teacher knows that we have teaching materials, and other countries have requested our teaching materials because they look at the Japanese American incarceration as a human rights violation. So other countries looked at this time in history as a human rights violation.
Hi, I'm Adrian, and I have a question. So,
Hi.
How do you think the U.S. should handle the Pearl Harbor situation?
Well, I'm not sure what do you mean. What do you mean by handle the Pearl Harbor situation?
Like, do you think they could have gone by a different way, handle it a different way?
Well, I think diplomacy. So diplomacy is a big key. We talk about this, especially in the United Nations, and that's why we have now diplomats. So now there's a diplomat corps in this country. There are these people that are diplomats that represent our country in Japan now and all across the world. So that hopefully will help relations as far as building confidence between the two countries and communication. You have to communicate, but also the one thing that we do not do well in this country is respect. We lack respect, and that's something that I try to promote. Respect for each other, respect for each other's differences, respect for our human rights. So if we don't respect each other, then we're not going to get anything done. We're not going to make this world a safer place. And at the time, the situation in Japan, I mean, certainly if you look at that world history, they were going in to invade, not only China, but that was one of the reasons why, with the tariffs and everything, that they attacked America, because there was no diplomacy in place to prevent something like that.
Nice and loud.
What camp was your father sent to and for how long?
I'm sorry. great question.
What camp was your father sent to and for how long?
What camps?
Oh,
Was your
I-
father sent to?
One of the 10 Japanese incarceration camps, the main one, my father and his family went to Topaz, Utah. So it was the north, Utah. That was the only camp that was in Utah, north of Salt Lake City. But all these incarceration camps, you have to realize, were built on desolate land. A lot of them were built on Indian reservation land. So I learned, especially in Arizona, Gila River at Poston, that even though the government built these prison camps on Indian reservation land and didn't even ask the American Indians permission, they just did it anyway. So that's a lack of respect. That was wrong of the government to assume that they can go onto other people's land and do what they want. So I'm trying now to bring that that point of education about what the government did, because they marginalized and disrespected another group of people like the American Indians as well as the Japanese Americans.
Question?
Hi, I'm Anna Sophia.
Hi.
What was your reaction when you learned about your father's internment in high school?
Well, I never, this is a long time ago, so this is before television shows like Law and Order and the rest of them. So I didn't know any attorneys, and I didn't know what it meant to have a federal prison record. I mean, it was, I just didn't know what that meant until my father tried to acquire his real estate license. So he can still vote. Now, in some states, if you have a prison record, you can't vote, but in California you can. So I know voting was very, very important to my parents. But I was very close to my daddy, so I could see the hurt in his face when he was telling me, that this happened a long time ago, and what he did, he felt he was right and the government was wrong. I could see this hurt going over his face, and it just was like somebody socked me in the stomach. And I just couldn't ask him any more questions because it was just too painful for him and was just too painful for me. Now, the irony to the story is I have a younger brother named Kent, who is 4 years younger. He was responsible for the 2-time Emmy Award documentary of civil wrongs and rights, the Fred Kormatsu story. But he found out about my father's Supreme Court case the same way in high school. And 4 years, as some of you, if you have siblings, know that's a big gap. So I said, obviously, we didn't have dinner talk because we didn't even talk about this in our family.
Next question.
Did you feel differently about your father after learning about the internment camps and the Supreme Court case?
Ooh, sorry, you really broke up. I couldn't even understand the question.
Did you feel differently about your father after the Supreme Court case or camps?
The Supreme Court case.
Did you feel differently about your father after you found out that he was in those internment camps?
No. No.
You still loved him anyway, right?
I loved many. It didn't matter to me. I didn't kind of understand. You have to realize that for all the Japanese Americans, I mean, because my father had been ostracized, meaning he wasn't part of the Japanese American community, my brother and I didn't, if you have different communities that are, whether you're Jewish or whether you're Chinese or whether you're, Islamic or whether, Hispanic, and you're in that community, you may associate with other people from that community. We didn't, because my father was quote, not welcome. So I didn't grow up with anybody, knowing anybody else like that, except for my cousins. And my cousins, when they found out about my father's case in high school as well, my uncle told him, they told my cousins not to say anything to my father, that if my father wanted to talk about his case, he would bring it up. It was a very painful time, and you have to realize when you're really stripped of your dignity and you're stripped of your right as being an American, there's this shame that you carry around on your shoulders, and all you want to do is, after you've been released from the prison camp, is to get on with your life, to take care of your children, to work, to build back what you lost, and to prove that you're good, American. So it was a very, very painful time.
Bro, it's not even that hard.
Just look at the camera and talk.
Hi, I'm Anthony. And I have a question. How did your father and his family react to the attack on Pearl Harbor and Executive Order 9066?
Well, my grandparents, my grandparents immigrated, first my grandfather, in, really he worked in the sugarcane fields, which was like slave labor in, 1904, and then came to San Francisco, and then my grandmother came later, so it was like 1912, and, so they were not American citizens. They wanted to become American citizens, but because of the laws, they couldn't. And that didn't change actually until 1952. That was a long time. And so they were in America legally, or they were documented, so to speak. So they were documented, but they were not American citizens. But my father, he didn't. He just happened to be of Japanese ancestry. He didn't necessarily identify himself as being, Japanese. He had a lot of Caucasian friends that he hung out with, and he couldn't believe, because of all the invasion. I know you have to study your history, so it's good to know what happens around this around Pearl Harbor, because the world was a little different place, and Japan was going into China, invading China and Korea. And so, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he thought, well, it was that something, Japan might do something crazy like that. They were very unpredictable and very aggressive. But because my father was an American citizen, he didn't think, that he would have any issues. He didn't know about his parents. My grandparents, I know, were just scared. Because what's going to happen to them when this executive order 9066 was issued? They can't go back to Japan. They really didn't want to. They don't have a country there. But then this government puts them in prison. So you're caught. You're in what's called catch-22. You're caught between no man's land. You've got no land. You've got no identity. What are you? You are a prisoner, and you're a prisoner of war. And some people who went to these prison camps in America, these were American concentration camps. And some people thought they were going to be shot and killed. Now, how would you like to have had, to see that? And you're a child watching all this. And some people were shot because they got too close to the barbed wire and they couldn't hear the guards because they were hard of hearing. So this was a terrible time in our country that really we should be ashamed of, and also to learn the lessons of, so that we don't repeat the history. Because I can tell you, after 9/11, when the Twin Towers and at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were bombed, they were talking about rounding up Arab and Muslim Americans and put them in American concentration camps. So this country comes very close to repeating its history.
Hi, I'm Barbara, and I wanted to know if you went through what your father went through in the incarceration camps, do you think you would have done the same thing he
Well, I hope. I mean, my father was 23 years old, so he was, not a teenager. He was of age. So if you're 18 years old in this country, you're of legal age, right? And so I'm hoping that I would have done the same thing. But that's why I speak out now. That's why I also, what I do now is anytime there are different court cases that are in direct violation to my father's principles and all that he stood for, and if it's a violation of people's civil liberties and civil rights, then I put my name to an amicus brief. An amicus brief is called Friends of the Court brief. This is the brief that goes to the court in support of the argument. So I put my name to an amicus brief for Trump versus Hawaii. So that first executive order was issued in February 27, 2017. So I put my name to that. And actually, unfortunately, the Supreme Court on June 26th, their opinion was to allow the government or to allow the president to stop people from coming into this country if he wants to, whether they're Muslims or immigrants, which is really wrong. It's all we're doing. All the Supreme Court did was replace what I said was one injustice for another. I wrote an article for the op-ed for the New York Times, and actually, Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor. Do you know who? Have you heard of Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in her dissent opinion, she named me Fred Kormatsu in her dissent, because she was saying that it was not a unanimous decision. It was a 5-4 decision. She had disagreed with the other majority of the Supreme Court, and she used my name and my amicus brief as support of her argument, because she said this is wrong to discriminate against immigrants as long as they go through the proper channels and the proper process. So you have to realize, is there anybody there Native American Indian? Anybody American Indian? Are you American Indian? Are you, are you Native Hawaiian? Native Alaskan? Yeah. Okay, so the point of this being, if you're not indigenous, Native, indigenous American Indian, indigenous Hawaiian or Alaskan, you are all immigrants. Your families are immigrants that came to this country. So it's like, should we have, if you were born here, should we have said that because your families were immigrants that you can't come to this country? Is that right? Okay, that's the lesson.
One last question.
What do you hope that America learns from the internment?
Good question. I'm hoping what America learns, because our campaign is to stop repeating history. So we want to be sure that this doesn't happen again, that we need to uphold our civil rights and our civil liberties for all those who are citizens and non-citizens. So you have grandparents, let's say, that are here, they may have, or people that have green cards, that have other documentation. They're non-citizens, or were brought in, if you were, some students like you, parents brought them into this country and didn't necessarily have the documents. But they've gone through college and they've done well, but they can't get a job because they're not citizens. But we need to help them as well. So, America was built on a land of immigrants. And for some reason, the message now is negative. So we're looking to you, this next generation, to change that, to let people know that people from other countries do have something to offer to make this country stronger. Because we, at the end of the day, what I hope to see is world peace. I may not see it in my lifetime, but I hope to see it in your lifetime. So that we don't have, people that threatening with nuclear weapons and nuclear missiles that are building nuclear power plants to come and bomb this country. Because that could still happen.